All right, guys, so I need to replace the wheel bearing on my Jeep Cherokee Trailhawk here. And I figured I'd make a video showing how to replace the wheel bearing, along with, while I'm in there, just doing the brake pads and the rotor as well. So a few things that you're gonna need to do if you're gonna wanna do this job. If you're just doing the brake pads or rotors, these are the ones that I picked up from AutoZone. All right, make sure you get the right rotor. If you got a Trailhawk, they sell two sizes. One that ends in 2.3 is a little bit smaller. If you have the heavy duty towing, then you're gonna need the 2.4. It's a little larger. This is the wheel bearing that you'll need. Also, you're gonna wanna go ahead and pick up one of these axle nuts as well. You can grab that for a couple bucks at a Dodge dealership. Other things I got here: gloves, some anti-seize to keep things from locking back up once we get it loose. To take the caliper off, you're gonna need one of these E14 nuts. You'll also need some 10mm wrenches. This one's a little bit thinner while you're taking off the caliper for the brake pads. You're gonna need, I think this is maybe 11/16, a little less than 3/4, or actually it's a 17mm, sorry, that you'll need to hold on while you're taking the caliper off. This is a 32mm socket for the axle nut, and then of course torque wrench, assortment of ratchets, some persuasion tools, and a slide pull for the wheel bearing. All right, so I'll try to keep this short in segments as we go along. All right, we'll start with the wheel. You're gonna need a 19mm socket to take this off. As well, make sure you jack it up and prop a jack stand under there for safety. All right, if you're doing the wheel bearing, you're gonna need to pop the center cap out so that we can remount the wheel, and then lower back down to get some leverage when we're loosening the axle nut. Otherwise, if you're just doing the brakes, you can go ahead and skip this step. But you just pry this ring off and press around and pop it down. All right, the next step for the bearing would be to loosen up this axle nut with our 32mm socket. So you can go ahead and, with the center cap out, remount the wheel with a couple bolts, lower it back down, and that way we can twist this off, and then we'll jack it back up and take the wheel back off. All right, so with this nut loosened up for the bearing, I'm gonna go ahead and work on this caliper. So a few notes: if you're just changing the rotor, you can go ahead and just remove these two mounting bolts for the caliper. One interesting note: this is a T55 socket that you're going to need, not just a normal hex head. So go pick up one of those. You might need an extension to get to the top one. The bottom one, not so much. If you are going to change your brake pads while this is still mounted, you're going to want to go ahead and loosen up these two nuts here on the top and bottom. This top one just loosens up this bracket for the brake line. Pull that out of the way, and then you'll actually have to loosen up the bolt itself underneath again with another 10mm, while holding on with your 17mm wrench to this slide pin underneath. Okay, so you can loosen those two up, and then this whole mechanism will kind of come out so you can get to the brake pads, and then we'll loosen these other two mounting bolts off, and we're gonna hang this caliper up with just a zip tie to our spring here. All right, before we get into the brake system, we have to actually set it into service mode. I've already done that, but you're gonna wanna just put it onto the run position, and then you'll go into your settings and go down to brakes, and then service mode, and then it's going to go ahead and run through this. Now, since I've already done it, you know, it's not giving me that screen. But when you go to shut it off, you're all done. Come back in here, make sure your seatbelt is on, and go ahead and push your foot on the brake, start the car up, and while you're holding your foot on the brake pedal, press down to release the parking brake. That should take it out of service mode. All right, next, to release this rotor, you're gonna need a 5mm Allen wrench, and go ahead and unscrew this counterclockwise. I know some rotors, you actually kind of put a bolt in and push it off. But this one you have to actually unscrew. If you try to tighten it, you're gonna strip that out and then have not a fun rest of the day. So unscrew that, and then use a little persuasion if it's rusted on to knock it off. All right, next, to get to the wheel bearing, I'm gonna need to go ahead and loosen up this axle. So the way that we're gonna do that is just taking a hammer here, and we wanna get this kind of flush with the front and have it stick out a little bit. And then we're just gonna whack on it, and it's gonna slowly push that shaft inwards, and you're gonna wanna just keep hitting it until this can push in and out freely. Right now it's jammed on there. You're gonna have to hit it hard and keep going until it's loose. All right, after about whacking that for about 5 minutes or so, we finally got it to the point where it's loose, and this is what I mean by loose. You gotta still put some force on it, because you should be able to push in and it'll slide back out, okay? So now that we've finally done that, we're gonna go ahead and come to the back of this wheel bearing. There are 4 bolts that hold it on, and of course, you know, being it is what it is, we have to use this 14mm e-torque star socket to get them off. So you have to come back here. You can kind of see there's one. So you're gonna have to wiggle your way around all 4. Might be helpful to have a universal joint swivel to make this thing swivel, make it easier. All right. So we'll work on getting those bolts out and move on to the next step. Real quick, before I go ahead and do that, go ahead and spray this whole thing down with some penetrating rust release agent. Just soak the whole area. Also, you may have to use a little cheater bar, because these bolts are on there tight. And when you take these bolts off, you'll notice that they have some Loctite on them, either red or blue. Before we put everything back together, we're gonna have to kind of clean all those up, scrape out all the old stuff, and then we'll put a little bit of blue Loctite on some parts that we might need to service later. All right. Not gonna lie, these are kind of a pain to get off, and you're gonna need to use some sort of leverage. So here I'm just showing, I got a ratcheting wrench with a flex head, or you can probably use a normal wrench, just extending this to give me a little bit of leverage to help get some of those stubborn bolts off. All right, now that we got all 4 bolts out and the penetrating oil has been working for a little bit, I went ahead and rented this slide hammer from AutoZone. You actually kind of go and buy it, and then you got to return it. But you just use the lug nuts and attach it in 3 points, screw this in, and you're just gonna yank as hard as you can for a couple minutes. Eventually you'll start to see some separation here, and it will pull off. All right, 3 hours later, and hopefully you can get it looking something like this. This thing was the worst to get off. So it was all rusted on there. Took a lot of hitting with that slide hammer, some rust release, and actually banging on it with a mini sledgehammer. Finally knocked it free. Had to chisel all the way around it. So that took a while. But now that it's finally off, I'm gonna go ahead and take my Dremel with a wire wheel here and just clean all of this surface up and on the inside of rust, and just sand all that down, and then go ahead and put some anti-seize all over everything. I'll show you what that looks like before we put new wheel bearing on. All right, went ahead and sanded it all down. So now I'm gonna go ahead, take my anti-seize, and just go ahead and you want to go and get the inside of this area as well as all the splines here and the outside mounting surfaces. So I'll go ahead and do that now. All right, so we got anti-seize on everything, even the bearing itself. You just slide that back on, and before we put the bolts back in, I'm going to put a little bit of blue Loctite on it. You could use red if you like. It says to torque these down to 70 foot-pounds. So we're going to try our best to get back there and do that as well. Another quick tip, as you're tightening these bolts up, make sure you go around evenly, one at a time. All right, now for the brake pads. I already went ahead and did this while I was in between brakes, trying to get that wheel bearing off. But anyways, you're basically going to take this part off, remove the old pads, and pry off these clips with a flathead screwdriver. I really like this Sill Glide stuff from Napa, just to lubricate everything. So I go ahead and I lubricate, and I actually kind of sand down and clean up the contacts here, but I'll lubricate before I put the clips on, and then I like to lubricate a little bit after, and then put some lubrication on the outside of the pads. Yeah, and then you just slide the pads in, and then we're gonna go ahead and bolt this back up to our new wheel bearing. All right, back on the hub. So come back up here. We'll put this back in place. Of course, we're gonna have to put the rotor on next. So we'll go ahead and do that. I also like to put some anti-seize on this wheel bearing before we put the rotor back on. Don't forget, before you put the rotor on, if you end up taking this brake guard off, make sure you put it back on so you don't have to take the rotor off and put it back on. All right, another tip, before we put this caliper back on, you're gonna have to depress the cylinder inside here. So what I normally do is, since we disengage the park brake electronically, this should be free to be able to press back in. Take a big C-clamp and just place it over top and you know, tighten it down, and it should give you enough leverage to push that back in. And then we'll just mount it back onto the mounting brackets there. All right, so since we're doing the wheel bearing on this as well, I have to tighten down this axle nut. So I already went ahead and kind of torqued it as much as I can, but you're gonna get to a point where this is going to want to spin with it as well. So we need to remount the wheel back on with just a few nuts so that we can then torque it. Set to torque to 147 foot-pounds on this axle nut. And make sure that you're using a new axle nut every time. You can get that at your local Dodge dealership. And then once we have this tightened down to 147 foot-pounds, we'll take the wheel back off, put it in the center cap, put it back on, put in the lug nuts, and it's ready to go.